Hello, I'm Frank Epstein, founder and president of Collage New Music. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our latest online presentation entitled The Composer Speaks. The Composer Speaks is an opportunity to introduce composers directly to you. Our guest today is composer Marty Epstein. Marty Epstein was born in 1952 and grew up in Nebraska. She received her Doctorate of Musical Arts from Boston University's School of Music, and she's taught at the Berklee School of Jazz for the past 30 years, and simultaneously at the Boston Conservatory for the last 15 years. She teaches composition and at the same time composes on commission. Marty, being on the faculty of two well-known schools of music, gives her a unique perspective on the music scene in Boston. She remains a well-regarded musical force, while she's beloved and respected by many of her students. And in case you're wondering, I should point out the fact that while Marty and I share the same last name, we are unfortunately not related. It is my pleasure now to introduce our music director, David Hoose, who will in turn introduce our guest composer, Marty Epstein. We thank you all for joining us, and we hope this experience will bring you closer to new music and the composers that write it.
Marty, it's a great pleasure to see you. It's been
Likewise.
way too long, at least a year, and
Agreed.
not just pandemic caused, but just our paths have not crossed, even though they have often in the past. But I'm really grateful for this opportunity to actually talk with you. I see you at concerts a lot. We played your music, but but even though we live ostensibly in the same city, it's a big city in a sense, and I don't know you very well. So I'm glad to have this chance for me and others to get to know you. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start off sort of in left field. There's an interesting quote I read of yours where you said, "I believe I am a visual artist who has only aural talent." So, can you talk to us a little bit about your relationship to painting as a youngster and today?
Well, it's interesting because I started playing the piano when I was about 4. I was just sort of always drawn to the piano. So music for me is like the constant background, whereas visual art, drawing and painting and engaging with visual artists and learning about what they do was sort of the external manifestation of my natural creativity. I don't know if that makes sense, but I have always doodled and drawn and painted and things like that. And I even actively got very engaged with it maybe 20 years ago or so, and I was taking classes um, and I tell this is going to be a little bit free ranging, which you said was okay. I tell my students the following story because a lot of my students tell me that they don't want to learn rules and guidelines about how to construct music and things like that. And what I tell them is, I've always loved painting and color and learning about visual artists and learning about the composition of not only works on paper, but sculpture and things like that. But when I myself do it, I am completely stopped and stunted by my lack of skill. I have
Lack of technique, right?
my lack of technique.
Yeah.
Exactly. I have a small amount of talent, and I just, even though I love it and it was my first love, I never had the drive to get deeply into the technique of it in the way that I have with music. With music, I said at the outset that that's sort of always been my background, my, sort of my inner core in a way. I've always had the drive to practice the piano, to score study, to do all of the nuts and bolts things that you must do to marry with your talent to become good at something. And I just don't have that drive with visual art, even though I feel like, when I'm composing, I feel like I am seeing the music in a way, and I almost always make a kind of graphic score of every piece that I write before I actually discover what the notes and the rhythms and all those things are. Maybe not so much a graphic score, but a map or a visual plan for the piece. So there's always this need or desire to make what's the sounds in my head visual, so that I can really understand what the proportions are and what the shapes are and all of these things. So I guess that's one of the ways that my love of the visual finds its way into music. And then the last thing I'll say about that is, as you know, because you've performed my music before, I'm very invested in the calligraphy of it, in the notation of it. I don't use a computer to notate my music. And I feel like that's a very real way to marry this love I have of visual art with my much more natural talent and much more natural inclination towards the working at music. I don't know if that answers your question
It does.
exactly, but
Do you still paint for the fun of it?
well, I sometimes do. I have, this is a very practical thing. I have arthritis in my thumbs. And so something like, if I didn't have any commissions, or if I didn't have any practicing I had to do, then I would probably do more painting. But I don't have the time in my hands, to add that to the mix. But when I do have that time, I do. I don't show that stuff to people. The painting that's on the homepage of my website is one of mine. And I have some of them hung up in my apartment, but I draw constantly. I doodle constantly. So, and like I said, I make these sort of graphic score type maps of every piece as part of the very initial process of composing it. So I guess in that way I do as well. I'm not necessarily painting, but I'm drawing. I have all these colored pencils, and I'm always sort of engaging with it in that way. And I have my favorite painters. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, we see sometimes we see a connection between, say, Picasso and Stravinsky's music, or
Exactly.
Kandinsky and Schoenberg's music.
Exactly.
If we saw one of your paintings or 5 of your paintings and heard a couple of your pieces of music, would we draw some kind of connection?
I don't think so. But if you saw, so I have one piece that I wrote as a response to Jackson Pollock's Troubled Queen. And I think there you might see a connection. Mark Rothko is a very, very important painter for me because of the sort of vast expanses of, on the surface, nothing happening. And then as you dive deeper, you realize a lot is happening. And so you might hear a connection between his paintings and my music. But I sometimes feel like my painting is my, sort of my, whichever part of your brain is associated with improvisation and freedom and just doing it in the moment, that's the part of me that you see in my painting. The part that's much more deliberate and much more worked out is what you hear in my music. And so maybe there are two sides of the same coin, but I don't know if it would be obvious to an observer.
So when you talk to your students, you teach at Berkeley College and at Boston Conservatory. They are now one. But when you talk to your composition students about needing to develop a technique or develop their technique and to really understand how music over the years has been structured and what makes a piece work and what makes a piece not work, and you get resistance, what do you think that resistance is about?
I think it's very age appropriate. in a way. I think that, because I think I may have been, maybe not like it to the extent that my students are, but like it a little bit. I think that they are so protective of their personal individuality, or what they think their personal individuality is, that they're afraid that any sort of letting in of outside influences, or letting in of a certain amount of craft, is going to negatively impact their creativity. And it's only experience that teaches them that letting in the craft and the technique actually releases the creativity. That's why I tell them about my painting experiences, because I'm incredibly creative as a painter, and then I paint the same thing over and over again because I don't know how to do anything else. And so I tell them that, and of course some of them believe me and some of them don't, but the ones who have a hunger to learn eventually realize that they are being set free. The more they know, the more their creativity takes on nuance and depth, and the more it's set free for them to be an even more an even more complex version of who they think they are. But I think at the outset it's just age appropriate. They're just nervous about losing this newfound thing that's special to them.
Is there anything that relates that thought process to today, as opposed to when you were a young composer just starting out at 17?
I don't know if there's anything that different, with the big exception of kids these days have access to so much more music, art, everything, because they have the internet. But what's interesting to me is, when I wanted to discover a new composer when I was in college, I had to, first of all, be told about it, or go to the card catalog, or check out an album and look to see what composers were on that album, and then go listen to other composers or other music by those same composers. It was a much harder won, not battle, but it was a harder won task, and now they have access to everything. And so with some kids, they just, they eat everything up, and they don't tend to have that kind of obstinance. But for other kids, it's almost like they're completely bombarded by so much stuff that they just retreat even further into this obstinance of I need to be who I am. There's too much stuff out there. So definitely that affects them. I think it affects different students in different ways, for sure.
Of course, the schools at which you teach are Boston Conservatory, and that is essentially a classical music school, with violinists and pianists and flutists and singers and composers, musicologists, and Berklee College of Music, which is an incredible model for bringing people into the musical world. Its focus seems to me from the outside is quite different, and that is that it's not finding its roots necessarily, its educational roots, in the music of Bach and Mozart, Brahms, Wagner, or even really Count Basie, for that matter. But it's more of the moment, of today. And I would suppose that in the context of the so-called classical music conservatory, it might be easier to convince a young composer that understanding something about voice leading or harmony direction might be apt and might be received. Might be harder in another context where the entire culture is focused on the here and now. And
yeah, that's.
Or am I wrong? Am I on the wrong track?
You're not wrong. The problem is Berklee has so much going on. at the school that you've described about 35% of it. Because in fact, we have a core at Berklee that includes, for everyone, 1 semester of counterpoint, and that, I refuse to use the word rules, but the guidelines for writing these 2-part counterpoint pieces very much come from Bach. And then for all writing majors, they have to take a counterpoint course that is 2- and 3-part inventions, and then composition majors go on, and film scoring majors go on and take a fugue writing class. So our counterpoint curriculum is very heavily invested in my opinion, the necessary knowledge of the masterpieces of Bach. And then we have what we call tonal harmony curriculum, which is really just sort of classical music theory. Then there are 4 semesters of jazz harmony. So we have some of that stuff. It's just that what you're describing, what you just described in your analysis of the difference between the 2 schools, is for most students the goal of what they want to do when they get there. They're like, I have to take this counterpoint class, but then I can't wait to get out of it so I can do what I really want to do. Mm-hmm. And so my job as their teacher is to try to show them where the connections are between what they want to do and what Bach was doing. And Bach, as I'm sure you know, is such a great example because there are not that many, there isn't that big of a chasm between what he did and what, a more contemporary pop artist might do. His harmonic language, you can find anything from the 21st century in pop music and in jazz. You can find anything, if it's tonal, you can find it in Bach, because he had such a harmonic imagination, almost greater than any other tonal composer, in my opinion. What's interesting is that at the Conservatory, the composers are much more invested in modern music and avant-garde classical music, or sort of post-classical music, if that's what we want to call it. And the composers I teach at Berklee end up being a little bit more conservative. Although this past semester, I had a composition class at Berklee they really blew me away. And plus it was on Zoom, so it was just completely unexpected how this class of students just took the concepts that they were learning. I'm talking about Cage and Schoenberg and Ruth Crawford Seeger and all these people. They took them and they really ran with it. And I haven't really had a class at Berklee like this before. So I'm wondering if now Berklee is kind of like the sort of the building blocks of our graduate program at BOCO. It seems like that could be sort of the way things could be moving now. But Berklee is so huge and so much goes on there that a lot of people don't know that we have this pretty rigorous core that's rooted in classical music. Mm-hmm.
So was this unique characteristic of the class you were teaching on Zoom? Was it a product of the circumstance, or did it just happen to be that collection of wonderful students?
I think it was both. So one thing that happened was that, and the students told me this after the semester was over, that they expected that the class was going to be terrible, because how can you have a class, it's called Contemporary Techniques in Composition. So how can you have a class like this that's remote when you don't have performances in class and it's just, me talking and them doing their assignments, but they don't get to hear them. And what surprised them is that I didn't let that happen in this class. I either had them write for each other, so they wrote a lot of solo pieces for each other. And then 3 times in the semester, I had friends of mine who I now owe favors to, either married couples or roommates, people who live together. I had my students write for them. So I don't know if you know Elizabeth England. She's an oboist, English horn player, and her partner, Greg. so my students wrote English horn and vibraphone pieces for one of their projects. Their last project was for clarinet and cello. So 2 former Boko students did these pieces for clarinet and cello. They did some prepared piano pieces, and one of our former students from Boston Conservatory read their prepared piano pieces. They all did these found percussion pieces, so they had to perform the pieces in class on Zoom. And the creativity that they exhibited, the assignment was they couldn't use a real or an actual musical instrument, and they all wrote pieces using things from their kitchens. And I think what happened was they weren't expecting that anything creative would come of this because it was on Zoom. And then when they realized they were hearing their music and they were allowed to be completely creative, I think that sort of opened a door for them. They all told me they were surprised at how well it went. And so I think it was that, but I also think it was the personalities in the class.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a common experience from the part of teachers, you know.
Yeah.
There was that unique class in 1974. I still remember it, you know, something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems like this is a good moment for us to take you way back, not to your painting necessarily, but to your first composing. You were born in Nebraska.
I was born in Colorado.
Oh, I'm sorry. We got it all
no,
wrong. I'm so
no,
far off.
It's actually not that far off because they're next door to each other.
Yes.
But I lived in Nebraska from age 4 until I went to college. So I'm a Nebraskan in my heart. So
your first composition teacher was when you were still in high school, and Robert Beadle, is that right?
Bedell.
So this is not a name that a lot of people might know. I had to look him up, listen to a little bit of his music. I wonder if he might tell us about what kinds of how you found him in the first place. Not every high school student is off studying composition.
Right.
And also what you found in him, or what he found in you. What were your first pieces like? What do you remember of them?
This is such a great question. And for some reason, no one ever asks me this. But this is a great question because, first of all, it gives me a chance to talk about the impact that high school music teachers can have on their students. So when I was in high school, I played the clarinet, I played the piano, I sang in the choir, I played the viola, I played the harp. You know, I was just doing all of these things. I knew I wanted to go to college to be a music major. I was sure I wanted to be a piano major. I was working on all the Beethoven sonatas. I was doing all the things that you do. And my band and orchestra director, Stephen Lawrence, said to me, you know, you have a unique talent at music theory. I took every music theory class I could take, blew through them. He said, you're also very creative. You also aren't good enough to be a professional pianist. So, and this, you know, hard to hear, but amazing, actually, amazing. Can you imagine if I had gotten accepted to a school? I did get accepted to the University of Nebraska as a pianist. And I tried to be a professional pianist with my, you know, I have limited technical skills. I'm very musical as a pianist, and I have like terrible technique. So it was a gift that he said that to me. And then the next thing he said was, but you have to be a composer. You have to try composing, and you have to do this.
And you had never written a single note of music?
I'd never written a single note. I had made an arrangement for him of some piece that he wanted, some marching band piece that he wanted our pep band to do or something. And I had an experience very similar to Takamitsu's. I wrote it out. Everyone took the parts, and to hear what I had written, to hear what that sounded like was, you know, almost like a drug. I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. And it wasn't even my music. It wasn't like my own music that I had written. He said, I want you to get in touch with Dr. Robert Bedell at the University of Nebraska. So he had been my Dr. Lawrence's teacher, my high school. And interestingly, he had also been, so my dad is a professional musician, and he had been my dad's theory teacher when my dad was in college. So, I wrote or called, I don't remember which one, Dr. Bedell and explained who I was. And he said, well, why don't you come down and we'll talk about what you want to do, and we'll see, if it could work. And so I drove down to Lincoln, which is only about an hour from Omaha. And I don't remember if I had written a piece yet, but we talked and he gave me some exercises, and he said, why don't you write a piece for 2 instruments and see if you can play it with one of your friends? And so, and here is one of the most important things that Dr. Bedell did for me. I said, okay, so how much do I owe you for the lessons? Because I was having this ongoing fight with my dad, who didn't want me to be a musician. And my dad, well, you're not going to be able to pay for these lessons. So it's interesting. My dad's a musician and he didn't want me to be a musician, but that's a whole other story.
Same here.
A lot of people have that story. So Dr. Bedell said, oh, I don't want you to pay me. Just, do the work and come have a lesson every month, and I don't want you to pay me. And so that also was very impactful, and because I couldn't believe that gift also. So I went home and I had a crush on this percussionist, and I'm not going to say who it was because he's actually a pretty well-known professional musician. So we'll just leave that part of the story out. But he brought his vibraphone over to my house, and it was for vibraphone and piano. And I had a little yellow cassette player, and I recorded it on my little yellow cassette player. This was in 1977. How else would you record something? And I had my first piece. And, I went down to Lincoln for my next lesson, and Dr. Bedell said, this is really interesting. I really like this part. You don't have enough harmonic variety. I remember he always said this to me, no matter what I wrote. You don't have enough harmonic variety. And it took me, and this, I think, is everybody's story. It took me probably 5 or 6 years to understand exactly what he meant. But he saw some element of creativity in my music that he felt very committed to nurture. The next piece I wrote was for Clarinet Quartet, which I played with my dad and 2 of my friends. I wrote a Sax Quartet, which Dr. Bedell was a saxophone player, and he, with 3 of his colleagues, played it and recorded it. And then the most amazing thing is that I wrote a piece for concert band, and we read it in my concert band in high school. And then Dr. Bedell had the wind ensemble at the University of Nebraska read through it and make a recording for me. So these kinds of experiences, I was just like, this was the best thing that could possibly happen, that I would write this music and people would play it and I would hear it. It was just, the most amazing experience ever. So he gave me good feedback, but he gave me the experience of hearing my music. And he gave me encouragement, almost more than anything was the important thing that he gave me. And, I drove down to Lincoln after I had already been in college for a couple of years to see him. And it was just, I don't know, it was just really great to get that kind of early encouragement from someone at such a young age, both from Dr. Lawrence, my high school band director, and from then Dr. Bedell.
You said that Dr. Bedell said your music doesn't have enough harmonic rhythm or harmonic direction.
Variety.
Harmonic variety. Harmonic variety.
Still doesn't.
I don't know all of your music. The music I know tends to be slow paced or patient. It's more like it's patient than it is slow. Wagner is slow, but your music is patient, and generally on the softer edge, quiet. How are you finding harmonic variety in your music now?
Um, I think that was a function of me just not knowing very much music. Um, if you so just to fast forward a tiny bit, I went to the University of Iowa for school, and David Lang was my ear training teacher. And David Lang said to me, okay, you want to be a composition major, tell me what living composers you know. And I knew John Williams, and this was in 1978. Interestingly, a lot of students now say the only living composer they know is John Williams, but which I think is a testament to him. But
Yes, I guess so.
but this was in 1978. Think of the people I didn't know who were alive. I didn't know Cage, Feldman, you know, I sort of knew Copeland. Benjamin Britten had just died. Stravinsky had just died like 5 years earlier, or 7 years earlier. So my ignorance was alarming, actually, in retrospect. And so I think that the lack of harmonic variety was just a function of me not knowing that much music, not knowing what was out there. And so where I find it now, I just, I might want to sit on a specific kind of harmonic structure for a long time, but now what I want to watch it do is slowly morph and change over that long time. And then the point at which I change it is part of the drama of the music. I might have a very, you use the term harmonic rhythm. I might want to have a fast harmonic rhythm and have lots of different kinds of harmonies happening, but I also might want to not do that and have maybe only one or two or three different harmonic structures over a period of time, and have them morph and change gradually into each other. Also, I try to listen to music that I don't naturally gravitate to, and I feel like composers like Boulez, and actually the performance that Collage did, or was it Cantata Singers of Sur Ansis?
Well, actually,
You
both
did it
Collage
both.
and Cantata Singers
Yeah,
did
yeah.
it with the same musicians, but
Right. So actually that set of performances and that
Boulez,
piece,
Surancies, yes.
yeah, it changed my whole outlook about Boulez. And now I listen to Boulez, and I find, I never would have thought to put that collection of pitches together to create a harmony. And that kind of thing is where I find harmonic variety too. Just listening to things that I previously had not gravitated towards.
What? So much to talk about. You mentioned earlier Rothko, the painter Rothko, and then in another paragraph, you mentioned Morton Feldman. I'm wondering what and you just talked about Pierre Boulez. I can't think of two more polar opposites than Feldman and Boulez. What do you find in Feldman's music for you as a composer, and also you as just as a listener? I don't think they're necessarily the same thing. We can listen to a composer's music and not have any connection between that composer's way of thinking or way of hearing and our own music, but get something very important out of it.
For me, with Feldman, the listener and the composer are one and the same, actually. What I love so much about Feldman's music is how he takes musical time and completely changes it for you, the listener. And then for me, the composer, I try to do that in my own music also. My most profound musical experiences have been being at a concert. The live experience is amazing. I heard Louis Goldstein do Triadic Memories it's probably actually 20 years ago now.
It's still going on.
Yeah, exactly. That performance was about 2 hours. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 5 hours. I had no idea how much time was passing. Or there was actually, again, a collage performance of for piano, violin, violoncello, the last piece. And once again, I know that piece well, and I know how long it is. And I know when the Debussy quote starts to come in, I know where we are in the piece. And still, I had no idea. Like, I'm completely taken outside of my awareness of the passage of time, and it becomes this very still experience, almost like, I liken it to the hub of a bicycle wheel, which is still, but the wheel is going like this, and how Feldman can do that, how it's just, it's magical to me how he's able to create that kind of an experience. And I crave those kinds of experiences as a listener, but I also like other kinds of music. So Boulez doesn't do that. He doesn't do it in the same way. I would argue that the boundary separating Boulez and Feldman is just one of speed, actually. The activity in Boulez is happening at such a rate that he also does this weird thing with time, but he's doing it by information density, and Feldman is doing it by patience and sort of removing the information density. Both of those experiences are valuable to me as both a composer and a listener. I would say a composer that I listen to differently as a listener and as a composer is Mahler, and maybe also Sibelius. Mahler and Sibelius are two of my absolute most favorite, most beloved composers as a listener of music. I don't know if I have ever learned anything concrete from them as a composer, although maybe the two are not necessarily that separate. But if I know that an orchestra in town is playing a Mahler symphony, I will go if I can, because that experience for me is, one of the most profound experiences, especially if it's the ninth, but any Mahler symphony, and any Sibelius symphony. And so in those experiences, I think, I might be separate, but of course I'm one person, so I don't know how separate I really am.
I hear a connection between your music and Sibelius's music. Not necessarily between your music and Mahler's music,
right?
But there is that slow transition that goes on in Sibelius's music, in which you're not actually aware that it's going from point A to point F, mm-hmm. until you're 3/4 of the way there, yeah. And you're not sure where it's going. Certainly, it's something like the Seventh Symphony, or even the Fifth Symphony, that accelerando that happens in the second movement that goes on forever. It just feels like it's a slow rocket ship taking off, but yes. You're not even, it doesn't seem to move at all at first.
Exactly. I have a funny story about that. Sorry to interrupt you. I studied with Charles Fussell for a semester when I was at BU, and we did not get along. He hated my music. I'm not making that up. We just clashed constantly. But the semester after I studied with him, Simon Rattle came with the City of Birmingham Orchestra to Symphony Hall and did 5, 6, and 7, Sibelius 5, 6, and 7. First of all, the hall was only half full, because who would go to that concert unless they loved Sibelius? So it was only Sibelius lovers in the audience. And I'm sitting up there and I see Charles Fussell, and he said to me, "Oh, now I understand your music."
That's great. That's great. Well, Charles is like that. He is open to a lot of things. I'm sorry there wasn't the breakthrough when you were studying with him.
Doesn't matter. It happened.
Yeah, it happened.
Great.
That is wonderful. Do you compose quickly or slowly? You might think that you would compose as slowly as your music is.
That is such a hard question to answer because I don't know at which point to start talking about entering the process, because I start thinking about a piece sometimes months or even a year before I actually put the pencil on the paper. Um, Once I'm putting the pencil on the paper, it goes fairly quickly, but I do so much pre-compositional thinking and making those sort of graphic maps, working things out on little scraps of paper. And then, of course, there's the process of the calligraphy. So probably from, if I'm writing, for example, let's say a 12-minute piece, from the initial concept to the inking of the double bar, that's probably a year. But the actual composing of it, putting the pencil on the paper, is pretty quick. That's probably about, 6 to 8 weeks, which might not seem quick. Mozart could write a piece in a day,
Yeah,
but
well, let's not
talk about
let's not
that.
do that.
Let's not talk about that. Besides, I think that's apocryphal anyway. I mean, some of it might be true, but yeah, I mean, it's maybe I shouldn't say quick. It's average. I'm not slow or fast. But the whole process, and it overlaps with the whole process for other pieces, can sometimes take as much as a year.
Do you throw things away?
I so I never throw anything away, and the reason is because I took. I mean, I might not use it in a piece, but I put it in this big plastic bin, because when I was in grad school at BU, I took a master class with Tam Musgrave, and I brought this piece to show her, and I had erased a bunch of stuff, and then I showed her the piece, and she said, "Yeah, this is interesting. What was here? What did you erase?" And I said, "Oh, it was bad." And she said, "Never, never throw anything out, because it's not right for this piece, but it might be right for another piece. So you never throw anything out." And I listen to that. Sometimes I'll go back and look through things and realize, oh yeah, this horrible thing for this piece actually is this great thing for this piece. So I don't throw anything away.
Well, certainly the technological entry into music notation, whether it's Sibelius, Finale, Dorico, has perhaps taken a profession away from musicologists, who would study the sketches and the layers of creation, because you just push delete and you replace it with something.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, for that composer it might be unfortunate, or for the musicologist it might be unfortunate, but more importantly, it seems like the process of depending upon the music writing program, the music transcribing program, to actually help the composing is problematic. And I wonder if you might talk about whether you share that view and what your thoughts are, because you are teaching at one of the most technologically savvy schools of music in the country.
Yeah, what's so interesting? When I convince my Berklee students to do their counterpoint projects by hand, and then they can input them, they can notate them on Finale if they want to, or whatever they use if they want to, but to actually do the composing by hand, they all eventually thank me. They all say, "Oh, this was so much more satisfying. I really felt like I understood what I was writing." I've never had anyone say, "Oh yeah, I liked my music better when I input it right away." So I think that what's happening is there's this seduction to the playback. There's this insecurity about not knowing for sure how the musical writing sounds. And so you press the playback and then you know what it sounds and everything's fine. The problem is no matter how good your sound library is, it will never sound like humans. It will never breathe. The balances are wrong. It will never sound like humans. And so what I think happens is that it stunts the creativity of composers, especially young composers. Professional composers who know what they're doing, I think that they can kind of get away with it maybe. But younger composers who have not developed their inner ear, it's terrible, because what they're doing is they're writing music that kind of sounds okay on the MIDI, and then you put it in front of live musicians and it's terrible. It's the balances are wrong, the voice leading is wrong, the voicing is wrong, the form is wrong, the pacing is wrong, like nothing is good about it. And so what composers have to learn to do, what I make my students learn to do, my private composition students at BOCO, they get this. They know if they're going to study with me, they're going to have to do this. At Berklee, it's a little bit of getting them on board. And I think when I tell them you can notate your music on the computer as long as you compose it by hand, then they're more on board. But the objective is to get them to learn to imagine their music, learn to imagine what the sounds are going to be like, and most importantly, learn to be comfortable with not knowing exactly how it's going to sound until you put it in front of live musicians. I think that gap. So I took orchestration with David Del Tredici when I was in grad school, and this is like the most valuable thing he taught us. He said, no matter how expert you are at writing for orchestra, there's always a gap between what's in your head and what you're going to hear. And the only thing you can do as a composer is to narrow the gap, but you should never aim to close the gap. And he taught this to us before Finale and all this stuff. This was like 1981 or 2 or something like that. He said, it's important to narrow the gap, but once you close the gap, once you're sure, then there's no imagination left, there's no mystery left. And this means that sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes you orchestrate something in a way that doesn't really make sense, but then you learn from that, and adjust accordingly. So the important thing is to learn to imagine your music, learn to hone your inner ear. Score study is the most important thing, because then you look at what other composers have done and you look at what works. And that's the way to learn how to compose anything, not just orchestral music. But yes, it's a little bit of a rough sell with my Berklee students. But once they figure it out, once they do that first, binary form minuet by hand, and they realize, oh, I could hear what I was doing, then, and I play everything for them so that they actually know what it would sound like played by a live human. So,
what are you writing today?
I am writing a piece for Sound Icon, Jeff Means' Modern Music Sinfonietta. It's my Guggenheim piece. I was a 2020 Guggenheim winner, and the important thing about that is it was, I think, the 28th time I had applied. So perseverance is very important. But anyway, it's for 12 instruments that actually are organized into 3 quartets. So it's violin, clarinet, bari sax, harp, bass flute, viola, bass clarinet, piano, English horn, cello, double bass, and marimba. And these 3 quartets basically play the same music throughout the piece, but at different speeds. So I'm trying to experiment with how to not only shape the overall musical time, but how to shape musical time amongst 3 ensembles. And it's a complete and total experiment, and it's something that I've been thinking about for years. Jeff and I have been talking about me writing this piece for them for literally like 5 or 6 years, and it's an experiment. I have no idea if what I'm imagining is going to be perceived by anyone audiating the piece, but I have to try. So
are you at the stage of note to paper?
Yes.
How is it going?
It's going well. It's going well. When when school was in session, I had a hard time just getting into my studio to work. But as soon as the semester was over, I was able to get in there. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, I had I think everyone did, I had a really hard time writing. But now it's become sort of a safe haven, even though in the back of my mind, I keep thinking, well, what if we never have concerts again? But I know that that's not going to happen. We're going to have concerts again, and it's going to be amazing. But at any rate, sitting at
get out of jail concerts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, talking with you is edifying in the highest way. And
Oh, thank you. Likewise.
I'm thrilled to get to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Me too.
I'm very grateful, and I will be keen to see and hear your Guggenheim piece.
Me too.
When it's done, or even if it's not done,
There's that.
Marty, thank you so very much for
you.
chatting with me and chatting with all of us today. We look forward to hearing your music and to seeing more of you in the concert hall.
I can't wait to be there and see all of you.
Good. Lots of love.
Yeah. Bye. Bye.
Collage New Music performed Marty Epstein's Elegant Oil and Sugar in October of 2017 at the Longy School of Music in Cambridge. During the work's brief span of about 8 minutes, 4 instruments, violin, flute, clarinet, and piano, wind around each other, hiding in the crevices of each other's lines. The music glistens patiently. Marty says that the piece was inspired by a video of the same name that lived at the ICA Boston, a video of sugar cubes with motor oil gently pouring over them, crumpling the sugar and creating little sparkles.